Welcome to the LBF Church Podcast, where we talk about issues that help us grow in our affections towards Jesus and also grow more equipped to follow him how he's leading us. I'm Dan Franklin, and looking forward to what we're going to tackle in this episode. But beforehand, I have a book recommendation, and then I want to answer a question from a previous episode of this podcast. So the book recommendation that I want to give is The Case for Life by Scott Klusendorf. And Scott Klusendorf is a big advocate for the pro-life movement, dealing with questions surrounding the issue of abortion. This is a great, very readable book on that subject. And it's great if you're a Christian or if you're a pro-life person. It's a very helpful book because it really walks through in a big picture, worldview way and medical way, and even to some extent in a political way, but just walks through the big issues surrounding this. So if you're somebody who's pro-life and wants to have conversations with people and actually helpful conversations with people, this book would be a big help for you. And if you're somebody who's pro-choice, and I would say especially if you're somebody who's pro-choice and you find yourself sort of mystified by the idea that people would come to the conclusion that abortion is wrong, I challenge you to get this book and to read it, because at the very least, what you'll experience is an articulation of what tends to be at the core of what drives people to be pro-life. But also, it'll be a book that will challenge some of your thoughts. And I think in a healthy way, will make you rethink your position. I, of course, because I am pro-life, I'm not going to hide the idea that I think it would be great for everybody to come around to that same conclusion. But great book, very helpful. Sanctity of Life, as we're filming this, Sanctity of Life, Sunday is right around the corner, so that's fresh on the mind for me and for several of us. So that's a recommendation for the week, but I also want to take on a question that came in from one of our previous episodes. Right around Christmas time, we did an episode talking about combating a spirit of greed at Christmas time. Had a lot of great comments that came in, and had a question from Susan, who says, "My question is, how do we as Christians effectively deal with those around us who are greedy? We Christians are taught to shun greed, but what if we have a greedy relative or friend who is always trying to take from us and others?" So actually, thanks, Susan. I see kind of two questions here. One is the question of, what do I do if there's somebody in my life that's exhibiting greed? And I'm assuming from the question sort of a Christian person. So I'm seeing a Christian. Christians are called away from greed. What do I do if I see this in somebody that's in my life? And what I'd say is, first of all, this is a little tricky because greed is not quantifiable. Greed is a sin, but it's not quantifiable in the same way that other sins are. Sometimes when somebody says something wildly inappropriate, you can just go up to them and say, "Hey, you said this thing. In fact, you said this thing at this time, at this place, to this person, and that was wrong." Or you can say, "You hit this person, and that was wrong." Or you cheated on your wife, and that was wrong. These are very objective, quantifiable things. And greed is not that way. It's much more of a posture and an attitude than it is necessarily a specific action. So what I'd say is, the Apostle Paul says greed is idolatry. If you see a brother or sister in Christ and you're seeing the way that they're living, and you say it seems like money really owns them and greed really owns them, you want to go to them in concern. The Apostle Paul talks about the whole idea in Galatians chapter 6 that we go in a spirit of gentleness when we're talking to somebody who's caught in some kind of sin. Jesus, when he talks about this subject, says you're going to win your brother or your sister. You're not going to win an argument with them. That's not the goal. The goal is to win them. So you want to go in humility. You want to go out of genuine concern for the person and say, "Hey, I love you, I care about you, and I see this in your life. I see this, and it makes me think that greed has a hold of your heart, and I care so much about you, and greed is idolatry. So I want to talk about this and see if there's anything that I can do to help you combat this." I would also say if it's not a person that you are close to and you're speaking into their life, it may not be your calling to say something about it. We're not called in Scripture to confront every single sin that we see in every single person. When God brings us close in people's lives, that's often where I think the greatest good happens, when we speak up to people. But the second question in this has to do with the whole idea of a relative or a friend who's constantly taking from others. And what I just want to suggest in that is, I don't know that that's necessarily greed. The problem might not be greed. The problem might be laziness or entitlement, or the idea that this is a person who is unwilling to take responsibility for themselves and for their own actions. And within that you got to just decide, are you enabling this person when they find themselves in another pickle and you bail them out again with more money, or when you act like their actions are totally fine when you think their actions are inappropriate. So you've got to discern in that the greatest way to help a person is not always by bailing them out. Sometimes helping them to see the dignity that they have as somebody created in the image of God, and helping them grow through the idea of taking responsibility for their own actions and for their own bills that they need to pay, can be something that is the much greater good for the long term. So discern in that, am I being an enabler, or should I just go ahead and keep with this behavior, and is it something that I should brush off? But thanks, Susan, for asking that question. And I just want to encourage you, if with this or any further episode or any past episode you want to ask a question about, go ahead and do that. I'll look to interact with you on the blog. And also some of those questions may make it to a future episode, and we'll talk about it with everyone. So the subject for this episode is courage. And the reason I want to talk about courage is because I believe that there's a movement in our culture that is shifting the way that we look at courage, and is calling certain things brave that are not brave. And so for starters, what I want to talk about is it's kind of two symbols for courage. And one that's been the historical symbol, not just the Christian symbol, but just sort of historically how courage is thought of. And then a second one that is sort of the new version or the new presentation of courage. So the historical, kind of the traditional presentation of courage could be symbolized in the soldier on the battlefield who looks at the danger ahead of him and knows that death may be waiting for him, but still decides to move forward and courageously risk death and risk injury by continuing to fight in the battle. And that's shown all throughout the stories that we read and the stories that we watch, that the great stories of courage are the people that face down danger and decide to move towards the danger. And this is shown in lots of biblical stories as well. There's a constant refrain not to fear. And there's a story in Numbers where Moses sends spies out to Canaan, sends 12 of them, and they come back to spying out the land, and they say, all right, the people there are really large and they're really daunting and we're not quite sure. But Caleb and Joshua, two of the spies, get up in front of everyone else and say, here's the deal. We can take them. God is on our side. I know that this is scary. I know that the soldiers are daunting, but let's go and do it. That's courage. That's the idea of moving towards the fray and moving towards the danger, even though it's scary. Now, oddly enough, the new symbol of courage that I'll acknowledge, I'm putting this forth. No one else is saying that this is the symbol of courage, but the new symbol of courage that I see in our culture is the soldier who looks at that same battle, who says, wow, it's scary out there and I might die out there. But instead of moving towards the danger, decides to desert. It's the whole idea of courage through surrender, or courage through moving away from the fray. Now, again, the people that would advocate for the form of courage I'm talking about, they probably wouldn't like what I just said, but I want to justify why I see the courage that we're talking about as a courage that's largely through desertion. I'll give some examples of it. So one example would have to do with the whole idea of marriage. If you've been married for any length of time, you know that all marriages face challenges and it's difficult, and there are times that you want to throw in the towel. And so this version of courage, this new version of courage would say, you know what? The brave thing is not to stay in that marriage. That would be cowardly. That would be just sort of sitting on your laurels and settling for something less great. The real courageous thing would be to have the courage to walk away from that marriage and try to start over with someone else and see if you can find happiness for yourself. It's the idea of courage. I'm being brave by deserting the battle and going somewhere else. This form of quote-unquote courage is also shown almost every time somebody comes out as gay. And I'm thinking specifically in the Christian community now. If there's somebody who has been a Christian figure or has been a part of a church and they come out as gay, one of the things that they'll normally say is, I was so tired of fighting. And to me, that's a very telling idea. Just the idea of saying, all right, I've been fighting this, or I've been fighting my temptations, or I've been fighting my instincts, and I've just decided it's time to stop fighting. Now, I'll just say for me, I'm very sympathetic to that. I can definitely understand how somebody could get there. But let's not call that courageous. Let's not say that it's brave. It's not brave to say, I have a really difficult battle ahead of me, and so I'm going to do the brave thing by choosing not to fight that battle. Another example, and maybe going from the less serious to even the more serious, there were some cases revolving around suicide over the past several years. It was very interesting to see the media coverage of them. And one of them was about 3 years ago. There's a woman named Brittany Maynard, and she became high profile because she had a horrible disease. She had, I believe it was brain cancer, and she was going through a lot of pain and a lot of discomfort, and it was just a terrible situation. She was a young lady. I think she was in her late 20s. Just a really tragic, horrible situation. And the reason that she became a public figure is because she very publicly was talking about the idea that she was going to choose to end her life. And she sort of became an advocate of that line of thinking, or of people having the right to do that, and taking away any shame or any stigma away from the idea that somebody would choose to end their own life. And it was interesting surrounding it because typically suicide had been treated in the public as something that was selfish and cowardly. The idea of saying that you're looking to escape from responsibility, or you're looking to escape discomfort, you're leaving your family in tatters. This is something that's selfish. This is something that's cowardly. And suddenly the media attention on Brittany Maynard was, look how brave this is. Look how brave it is for her. And similar things were said about Robin Williams after he took his own life several years ago. And it's interesting to look at this because I'm not at all advocating that you go up to somebody who's just lost somebody to suicide and say, well, your relative was selfish or your relative was cowardly. That's not a helpful interaction to have. But it was odd to say, well, we as a culture, are we moving towards a point that we would say when you're facing a debilitating disease or when you're facing a painful battle ahead, the brave thing to do is to go ahead and take yourself out? You could argue whether it's understandable. I would say it certainly is understandable to have that desire. But it's odd to call it brave. We've got this idea of courage through surrender. Courage through saying, my marriage is too tough, so I'm going to do the brave thing and walk away. They're saying, my sexual temptations are too tough, so I'm going to do the brave thing and cave in and just give in to them. My health is just too tough, or my situation is too despairing, or my life is just too depressing, so I'm going to do the brave thing and go ahead and commit suicide. These things are not brave, but they're being presented as brave. And it's a very self-referential idea, the idea that I'm sort of the center of the universe, and so I've got to do what's right by me. The brave thing is for me to do what's right by me. Now, the one area of all of this that I could say you might argue is brave, because courage has to do with the idea of risk, is you could say when people do these things, they are taking the risk of being labeled a coward. And in an odd way, you could say, well, it's sort of courageous to take the risk of being labeled a coward. Beyond that, I'm not really sure why we would call these things brave. You might even try to make the argument these things are okay to do. But the idea of calling them courageous actually inverts the whole idea of courage. It takes it from the idea of saying, I've got a fight ahead of me and I'm going to move towards the fray, towards saying the real brave thing is to say, that fight is not something I want anything to do with, so I'm going to walk away from it. Now, in all this, some of you might be saying, all right, well, this is an interesting theoretical critique of our culture, but why does this matter? Why is this important? And for me, I'd say the reason this is important, and it was on my heart to do an episode about this, is because as Christians, we are constantly facing battles. We're constantly facing temptation. We're constantly facing things that are dangerous, and we're called to take risks. In fact, one of the great passages, I mentioned Caleb and Joshua earlier, but one of the great passages on courage takes place at the beginning of the book of Joshua, when Moses is dead and Joshua has taken his place. And in chapter 1, verses 6 through 9, there's a refrain about courage that God gives to Joshua. He says in verse 6, "Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give them." Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all my law that my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. And then one more time in verse 9, have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. This refrain to Joshua is echoed throughout the Old and the New Testament. The whole idea of don't be afraid, move towards the fray, move towards the danger. Even though it's scary there, even though those enemies might seem really daunting, even though those temptations might seem like too much, even though you might see only despair and difficulty ahead, move towards this, be courageous. In fact, those are the words that the Apostle Paul uses right at the end of the book of 1 Corinthians. He says, all right, stand firm, be courageous. Courage has to do with the idea that we are going to fight battles. We are going to suffer temptations. We're going to have times that we want to throw in the towel. But God says to Joshua, don't throw in the towel. Don't move away from the fight. Don't settle where you are instead of moving into the land that I've promised. It's scarier to move forward, but go ahead and move forward. And as we get into sort of the modern view or the competing view, that real courage is found through abandoning the difficulty and moving towards the more immediate thing, whether it's pleasure or money or just physical safety. The danger with that is really, it's, as I mentioned, it's very self-referential. It's the idea that I'm the center of the universe, and really the brave thing that I need to do is I need to be true to myself. I need to be true to myself, and so if somebody's coming out as gay, a lot of times that has to do with the idea of, hey, I need to be true to myself. This is who I am. This is how I feel, and so it would be cowardly for me not to sort of come out with this. Or I need to be true to myself and admit I'm unhappy in this marriage, or I need to be true to myself and acknowledge that I have dreams for my life, and this baby that I'm currently carrying doesn't have anything to do with that, so I'll go ahead and have an abortion, or I'm going to be true to myself and just sort of move away from this doctrine of Christianity that's not really thought well of right now, and so I'm going to be true to myself in those ways. What I want to say is there is not a biblical or Christian value on being true to ourselves. That's not an idea that we see promoted through Scripture. Now, what we do see on the positive end is that we are all uniquely created in God's image, and you don't need to be ashamed of sort of the immutable aspects of yourself. There's no reason to be ashamed of your race. There's no reason to be ashamed of your gender or ashamed of how tall you are or how good looking you are or what some of your basic personality traits are like. The idea is, yeah, you don't need to be ashamed of those things. In those ways, you can embrace who God has made you to be. But the entire Christian message is we are called to deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Jesus. In fact, the Christian message tells us there's all kinds of things wrong with us. That's why God's wrath is against us. The Christian message is not be brave by being true to yourself. The Christian message is be brave by being willing to fight the battles and fight whatever it is that it takes for you to get to the other end of what God is calling you to. Be willing to fight those temptations. Be willing to have that scary conversation with that other person. Be willing to stand for something that God says is true, even when you know you're going to get disfavor from people around you. Be brave and lean into the fray instead of moving away from the fray. So let me just talk practically about this. How do we live this out? What do we do about this? And the first big thing that I want to say is it can be very brave to acknowledge our fear and weakness and at the same time not stop fighting that battle. You know, if you go back to that vision on the battlefield and the soldier's looking ahead and he and his fellow, the rest of his platoon are about to be sent out into the fray. And just imagine one soldier turning to the other and saying, man, I am so scared. I am scared out of my mind right now. And the other soldier turning to him and saying, I'm just as afraid as you are. And then they put their hands on each other's shoulders, kind of pump themselves up, and then they move into the battle. That's amazing courage, because there's the acknowledgement, this is scary. I don't know if I'm up for this. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if we're going to live through this. I'm so afraid, but I'm still going to do it. That's true courage. True courage is acknowledging to a brother or sister, I don't know if I'm up for this. I don't know if I can keep going. If your marriage is really difficult, saying, man, there are some times that I'm just ready to give up. If you're dealing with real health issues, you might be saying, gosh, sometimes I just want to despair and want to get mad at God and just want to forget all of this. Or if you say, man, the place that I work, they so slander Christianity that there are times that I just want to shrink away, and I'm tempted to shrink away and to stop standing for Jesus. It can be courageous to acknowledge those things because you're becoming vulnerable with someone else. What is not courageous is giving in to those temptations. The great courage is acknowledging your fear and acknowledging your weakness and then saying, all right, let's go. I know what God has called me to do. Jesus set the ultimate example for us in this in the Garden of Gethsemane. When he's praying to the Father, if there's any other way to do this, if there's any way that this cup of suffering could be taken away from me, man, I want to do that. And then his very next words were, not my will, but your will be done. He's saying, I'm scared. I'm intimidated by all of this, but I'm willing to move forward if this is what I'm called to do. So be willing to admit your fears, admit your weaknesses, but still move forward in what God is calling you to do. Courage is found in continuing towards the fight. Just yesterday, there's a movie that a friend and I saw about Winston Churchill. It's called The Darkest Hour. And it walked through the beginning of World War II and Britain's role in that, and sort of the battle going on the political side was, do we continue in on this fight, even though right now it's not going well for us, or do we look towards appeasement and surrender in terms of peace, and what will be entailed with that? It was a very powerful movie where you could feel the battle and you could feel the tug of both sides, the side to want to fight on, but also the risk that was involved with that, and how it would have been very easy just to take the side of appeasement and putting off the fight and moving away from it. And there was a quote from Churchill that was up on the screen at the very end of the movie, and it simply said, "Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." And I thought that was so poignant. And these things that I'm talking about right now were already on my mind for this episode. To talk about the whole idea of saying, man, we move into situations, and courage is not the idea that you're not afraid. Courage is that you see the deep risk and you still move forward. And you even move forward knowing, as Churchill says, that failure is not fatal. You may move into something and you may take sort of an immediate loss. You may be a step down in the eyes of other people, or you may try to accomplish something and find that it didn't go very well. You may take a risk in stepping out for Jesus and talking to a friend about him and have it not go very well. And failure is not fatal. The courage to continue is what counts. And what God calls us to is a deep trust to say, if I abandon the fight right now, I get an instant reward. I get the instant reward of getting to do whatever I want, and so I experience pleasure, or I get the instant reward of moving to a place of greater safety and security, or I move to the instant place of getting approved by, having other people approve of me, and that feels really good. And the courageous thing is to trust God for the reward that he will bring as we move towards the fight instead of abandoning the fight. So as believers in Jesus, let's hold towards the courage that he calls us to. Not a courage of desertion, not a courage of somehow being true to ourselves, but a courage of trusting God enough to move towards the danger, even when we're terrified of what the next step will lead us towards. As I mentioned earlier, I'd welcome any thoughts, comments, questions that you have about this or about other episodes that we've done. If you want to do that, what you can do is you can just go to lbf.church, our website, and you can click on the little tab that says blog and podcast, and you'll find this and other episodes there and the videos of them. Just go ahead and leave a comment. I'd love to get back to you and interact with you about that. You can also go on iTunes and just search for LBF Church podcast, and you can download all the past episodes of that there. While you're there, please do give us a rating or review, because that'll help us get the word out to more people, because the goal of this is to help people grow in their affections towards Jesus and grow more equipped to follow him in all the ways that he's leading us. So thanks so much for taking the time to listen. I'm Dan Franklin, and this is the LBF Church podcast.